In Paris, at the turn of the 20th century, there was a French count who spent money the way other men breathe. He built himself a palace out of pink marble. For a single evening party, he rented an entire park in the middle of the city. There were yachts, there were racehorses, and there were diamonds for women who were not his wife. And every dollar of it belonged to somebody else. It belonged to his American wife, and to the railroad fortune her father had left her. Over 11 years, Count Boni de Castellane ran through as much as $10 million of that fortune. At the height of the marriage, one accounting of their life put the number in the plainest terms anyone could ask for. She was handed about $600,000 a year. That is $50,000 a month. That is $2,000 every single day for 11 years. And her husband spent all of it, and then he found ways to spend more. Everybody who knows this story knows that part. The count who burned through a fortune. What almost nobody knows is why it never destroyed her. Because the richest bride in America walked out of this marriage, and she did not walk out ruined. She walked out a duchess, still rich, and she stayed rich for another 50 years. The man who spent the fortune is the one who ended up poor. And the reason why is the most useful thing that anyone who will never inherit a dime can take from these people. It was never how much money the Goulds had, it was how it was locked. To understand how a woman survives a man spending $2,000 a day of her money, you first have to understand where that money came from and what kind of girl was sitting on top of it. Because Anna Gould was not born into old, settled, aristocratic wealth. She was born into the newest and most hated money in America. Her father was Jay Gould, and in the 1870s and 80s there was no more reviled businessman in the United States. Jay Gould was the robber baron the other robber barons were nervous around. He was a railroad speculator and a market manipulator, a small, quiet man in a study full of ticker tape who wrecked companies and cornered markets for sport. Gould fought a war for control of the Erie Railroad and won it by printing new shares out of thin air. In 1869, he tried to corner the entire gold supply of the country. And when the scheme broke, it dragged the national economy down with it on a day the papers named Black Friday. The newspapers called him the most hated man in America, and they were not stretching the phrase to sell copies. When Gould died in 1892, he left a fortune the popular figure put at around $72 million, though a formal appraisal of the estate ran higher, above $80 million. Either way, it was one of the largest fortunes in the country, built by a man almost no one could stand to be in a room with. A study of the family's money years later, called The Realms of Gould, laid out the size of it and the shape of what he did with it, and the shape is the part that saves his daughter. And here's the first thing to hold on to, because it is the whole game by the end of this story. Jay Gould did not leave that money to his children in a heap. He was a suspicious man, a man who had spent his life watching other people try to take what was his and taking what was theirs first. So he wrote a will, and the way he wrote it would, 20 years after his death, defeat a French count he never met, without the count ever understanding what had beaten him. Jay Gould had 6 surviving children, and Anna was the youngest daughter, born in 1875. By every account that comes down to us, she was not the beauty of the family. Writers of the time described her as plain, awkward in a ballroom, uneasy in the glittering society her money bought her a ticket into. There was a cruel line that followed her in those years, a piece of drawing room wit that made the rounds. She is more beautiful, people said, seen from the dowry. It was a joke about one thing and one thing alone. Anna Gould's face was ordinary. Anna Gould's fortune was not. And in the marriage market of the 1890s on 2 continents, the fortune was the only feature that got counted, because there was a trade running in those years, a very specific one, and Anna Gould was about to become one of its most famous examples. On one side of the Atlantic, you had American families, brand new money, railroad and steel and mining money, anxious in society, desperate for the one thing dollars could not manufacture, which was an old name. On the other side, you had the aristocracy of Europe, families with titles that went back centuries and castles they could no longer afford to heat. The titles were real, and the cash was long gone. So a market formed, the way a market always forms when each side wants what the other one has. American money flowed east, European titles flowed west, and everyone involved called it love. And almost no one meant it. Anna Gould was not even the biggest example of this trait in her own year. 1895, the year she married her count, was the same year Consuelo Vanderbilt, granddaughter of the Commodore, was marched down the aisle to marry the Duke of Marlborough. That settlement got written in black and white for anyone to read. The Duke received railroad stock valued at $2.5 million, plus a guaranteed income of $100,000 a year, in exchange for making an American girl a duchess. Consuelo said later that her mother had locked her in her room to force the match, that she wept behind her veil at the altar, and that the Duke informed her on the honeymoon he had married her to save his family's estate and nothing else. Their marriage limped on for a decade, then separated, then ended in an annulment. That was the going rate, and that was the honesty sitting underneath it. Two of the richest young women in America, in 1 year, sold across an ocean for a coronet. Anna's coronet arrived in the shape of Count Boni de Castellane. And you have to understand what Boni was, because the man was dazzling. In the Paris of the Belle Époque, Boni de Castellane was the arbiter of elegance, the single most fashionable man in a city that treated fashion as a serious art. He came from one of the oldest noble families in France, with exquisite taste, a genius for spectacle, and a manner that made him the most talked about young man on the continent. Boni was charming, cultured, and flat broke. His family had the name and none of the money. And then, in New York, this beautiful broke aristocrat met a plain, unhappy, staggering, rich young American woman, and the market did the thing the market does. They married in New York in March of 1895. That detail, the wedding on American soil in New York, under American law, is going to decide this entire story by the end. So hold on to it. For now, all you need to know is that a French count with an empty treasury had married into one of the great fortunes of the Gilded Age, and he intended to enjoy every franc of it. So let us count the ways he spent it. Because the burning of Anna Gould's money was not one dramatic collapse you could point to on a calendar. It was a steady, joyful, 11-year bonfire. And it is worth counting down, from the smaller extravagances to the ones that made even Paris stop and stare, so you can watch the machine at work. Start near the bottom with the opening move. In the first year of the marriage alone, Boni bought himself a schooner, a proper ocean-going yacht, and 2 chateaux in the French countryside. That was the warm-up act. A young man who had never held real money in his life was handed access to one of the largest fortunes in America, and his very first instinct was to buy a boat and 2 castles before he had unpacked. These, at least, were things. A yacht can be sold. A chateau holds its value. This was the most sensible spending Boni would ever do in his life, and it was already far beyond the reach of almost any noble family in Europe. It was the sound of a man testing how deep the well went, and finding no bottom to it. Move up a rung, to the parties, because the parties are where the money stopped being things and turned into smoke. Boni de Castellane threw the most famous parties in Paris, and Paris was not a city you impressed by accident. Time magazine, looking back on the whole affair, described the marriage as an 11-year phantasmagoria of pink marble palaces and $150,000 parties. Sit with that figure for a moment. $150,000 in 1890s money for a single evening. For one party. The most famous of them came in the summer of 1896 out in the Bois de Boulogne, the great park on the western edge of Paris, thrown to celebrate Anna's 21st birthday. Boni staged it as a recreation of a royal festival from the court of Louis XIV, the fifth day of the Sun King's own wedding celebrations brought back to life. There were footmen in period costume, orchestras hidden in the trees, a spectacle staged on the water, the entire apparatus of a vanished monarchy conjured up for one night and paid for with railroad money from the United States. When the guests went home, nothing was left of that money but the memory and the invoice. Now, before we climb any higher, let me be straight with you about that $10 million figure, because it has earned some honesty. $10 million is the number that has trailed this story for over a century. It is the figure the newspapers reached for in 1906. But careful historians who have gone through the accounts set the real total lower at something closer to $5 or $6 million. I am not going to pretend to you the bigger number is settled fact. Whether Boni de Castellane burned $10 million of his wife's money or a mere $5 or $6 million of it is a distinction without much of a difference. Both numbers describe a man setting fire to a fortune that could have set up generations and doing it inside a decade for the fun of it. So when you hear 10 million, hold it with a loose grip and know that even the skeptic's figure is a catastrophe. Which brings us up to the single largest monument he built out of her money, the Palais Rose, the Pink Palace. On the Avenue Foch, one of the grandest streets in Paris, Boni de Castellane raised a palace of pink marble, modeled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles, the pleasure retreat of French kings. The land alone, 2.5 acres in the most expensive district of the city, cost 3.5 million francs before a single stone was set. Inside, Boni built a staircase as grand as the one at the Paris Opera, a ballroom that could swallow a crowd, and a private theater that seated 150. Kings and queens of Europe came to his rooms there. It stood, in its moment, among the most beautiful private houses on earth. And Boni himself, years later, looking back on the whole adventure from the far side of ruin, described the building of that palace in one devastating phrase. He called it his slide into the abyss. The man knew, even in the middle of doing it, that the Pink Palace was the point where extravagance turned into a fall. Let me stop the countdown here for a beat and put a question to you, because it is worth sitting with. If you had been one of the Gould family trustees back home in New York watching this Frenchman spend $2,000 a day of your family's money on marble and orchestras, what would you have done? Because the family did notice. The family was watching from across the ocean the whole time. And the family was about to do something about it. Hold that thought. Because there is one more rung on this ladder, and it is the ugliest one. The money that went to other women. When the New York papers laid the marriage bare in 1906, one of the details that fell out was that a great deal of Anna's fortune had not gone to palaces or parties at all. It had gone to Boni's mistresses. He was, by then, unfaithful in the open and unfaithful at great expense, showering gifts and jewels and settlements on the women he kept, all of it drawn from the railroad fortune of the wife at home raising his children. And that is the detail that breaks the polite fiction under this whole arrangement. Because the story everyone likes to tell is that these matches were love dressed up as business, or business softened by a little love. But a man does not fund his mistresses out of his wife's inheritance if this was ever, at any point, about love. The dowry was the draw. It had always been the draw. Boni had married a fortune, and he treated the woman attached to it as an inconvenience with the bank account. So why did no one stop him sooner? Why did this run for 11 years? That question takes us to the top of the countdown, to the real engine underneath every rung, which was Boni himself. Because there was no break inside the man, none at all. Boni de Castellane spent money the way a compulsive gambler plays cards, and he said as much in his own memoirs, describing a passion for spending as strong as the passion that pulls some men to the card table night after night. It was not that he made a run of bad decisions a wiser man would have avoided. It is that nothing inside him could ever form the word enough. The yacht led to the chateau led to the parties led to the palace, and the palace led to the mistresses, and each step felt, from the inside, like the obvious next thing a man of taste and standing would do. Left to his own instincts, Boni de Castellane would have spent every dollar of the Gould fortune down to the last cent, and then borrowed against the name and spent that too. The man was a perfect engine for turning money into smoke. And that is the exact point where most versions of this story stop. The fortune burned, the marriage collapsed, the American heiress ruined by the French wastrel. 1906, divorce, disaster, the end. If you have heard of Anna Gould at all before today, that is most likely the shape of what you heard, and it is wrong. Because we have now reached the most important fact in this entire story, and it is a fact about a decision made by a man who had been dead for years before Boni spent a single franc. The number one reason Anna Gould's fortune survived Boni de Castellane is Jay Gould's will. Go back to that suspicious, hated little man dying in 1892, 3 years before the wedding. When Jay Gould wrote his will, he did not hand his children piles of cash to spend as they pleased. He locked the money. He divided his fortune into 6 equal trusts, one for each child, each one worth something around $12.5 million. And here's the mechanism, the small legal machine that changes the whole ending. Each child received only the income from their trust. The income, not the principal. The principal, the main body of the fortune, could not be touched, not by the child, and so not by anyone the child happened to marry. It stayed locked, and at that child's death it would pass down to the next generation whole. Anna Gould never owned a seizable pile of millions that a husband could get his hands around. What Anna owned was an income. A vast income, but an income. Now set the second lock on top of the first. Remember that the wedding was held in New York, under American law, and remember that I told you it would matter. Under the French law of the day, under the Napoleonic Code, a husband would, as a rule, have gained control over his wife's property the moment the two of them married. Boni, as a French count marrying in a French world, would have expected that control as his birthright. But the Gould family were not fools, and they did not walk their heiress into that trap. The marriage settlement was drawn under American law on purpose, so that Anna kept her fortune and kept her options, including the option to one day divorce the man. So Boni de Castellane, this perfect engine for burning money, found himself married to one of the largest fortunes in the world and unable to reach the fuel tank. He could spend the income, he could spend whatever principal Anna herself chose to release into his hands. But the great locked body of the trust, the fortune itself, sat as far beyond his reach as if it had been kept on the moon. Run the math and you can see the whole thing at a glance. Anna's trust was worth something on the order of $15 million. It threw off somewhere between $500,000 and $700,000 a year in income. Over 11 years, that income alone came to $6 or $7 million, and on top of it, Boni got his hands on some principal that Anna released along the way. Which means the famous $10 million he spent, taken even at its highest, was drawn from the river and not the reservoir. He was spending the interest and skimming the edges of the lake. The core of the Gould fortune, the thing Jay Gould locked away in 1892, was never once on the table. Boni de Castellane spent a fortune. He never got near the fortune. So when the marriage came apart in 1906, and Anna Gould divorced her count, she did not step out into poverty. She stepped out with the trust still humming behind her, still throwing off $500,000 and more every year, doing the exact job her dead father had built it to do. The bonfire had been enormous and loud, and it had lit up the front pages of 2 continents, and it had burned almost nothing that counted. Now watch what happened to the two of them once the fire went out, because the ending is where the whole lesson lives. Start with the Count, Boni de Castellane, the arbiter of elegance, the man who raised the Pink Palace and threw the greatest parties in Paris, was divorced at the age of 39 and cut off from the fortune that had funded his entire adult life. And he found that when the river of income stopped flowing, he had nothing. No savings, no reserve, no principal of his own, because he had never in his life needed to build one. His creditors came for him. Boni, this connoisseur of beautiful things, was forced to earn a living for the first time, which he did in the one way open to a man with his eye, by dealing in art and antiques, trading on his famous taste for a commission. He resigned himself, one account says, to a life of comparative poverty, and he did it with good humor. And then, in the most fitting turn the story could take, he wrote his memoirs. Boni wrote 2 of them. The second one he gave a title that reads, "Today Like a Confession." He called it The Art of Being Poor. The man who had spent as much as $10 million of another person's money died in Paris in 1932, 65 years old, a week after a stroke, having written with his own hand the book on being broke. Now turn and look at the woman everyone had called ruined. Anna Gould took her still intact fortune and did something Boni himself would have admired the shape of, even if he would have hated the target. She traded up. In 1908, 2 years after the divorce, she married again, and this time she married Boni's own cousin, Palais de Talleyrand Périgord, who happened to be a duke. So the plain girl mocked as beautiful only from the dowry, the heiress the world had written off as destroyed, became the Duchess of Talleyrand. She had gotten the higher title and kept the money both. And the money kept coming, year after year, for decades. Across her long life, that trust her father built paid Anna Gould close to $35 million in income. She inherited millions more when a brother died without children of his own, and his locked trust flowed to her. And having watched one husband try to set her fortune on fire, Anna spent the rest of her days being careful with it, careful to the point that people remarked on her thrift. She died in 1961, in Paris, at the age of 86, the Duchess of Talleyrand, still holding a vast fortune. She had been the last private owner of Lyndhurst, the Gould family estate up the Hudson River, where she kept a private collection of thousands of orchids worth a small fortune of its own. The wealth her father had locked away in 1892 had now survived a robber baron's death, a French count's 11-year bonfire, 2 world wars, and close to 70 years of history, and it was still there. The dazzling spender had written The Art of Being Poor. The plain heiress had died a rich duchess. Structure had beaten spectacle, in full. And that is the reason this story is worth your time. Even though the odds are strong you will never have a $15 million trust of your own to lose sleep over, because the lesson does not scale with the number. Watch what happened here one more time. You had a fortune, and you had a man doing everything within human power to destroy it, spending $2,000 a day, raising marble palaces, funding a string of mistresses with no break and no shame in him anywhere. By every rule of drama, that fortune should have been ash. And it was not, for one reason and one reason only. Because someone who came before had built a structure around the money that a spender could not break. The fortune was locked so that only the income was ever left exposed. The principle was untouchable by design. That is the whole thing, right there. It is not how much money you have. A lottery winner holding $10 million and no structure is broke inside 5 years, and there are rooms full of them to prove it. It is how the money is held. A trust instead of a checkbook. Principle you cannot reach on a whim, and neither can anyone who charms their way close to you. An arrangement written by a cautious mind on a calm afternoon, so that on the worst day of your life, when the beautiful person across the table is doing their level best to spend it all, the core of the thing cannot be reached. Jay Gould was a hated man who did a great deal of harm in his years above ground. But the one real gift he handed his daughter was not the money. Plenty of heirs are handed money and lose it inside a generation. The gift was the lock. And that lock outlived the man who built it, outlived the count who tried to break it, outlived the marriage that tested it, and carried a plain, mocked, underestimated woman all the way to a wealthy old age as a duchess on the Hudson. Boni de Castellane understood beauty better than almost any man alive in his time. He never understood the one dull thing that keeps a fortune standing. Anna Gould was not the beauty in the family, but she was the one, in the end, still holding the money. The Goulds had the lock, and it saved them. There was another American family who had even more, and who never built a lock at all. The Astors were the richest family in the country, the family that decided who counted in American society for 50 years, and they were certain the money would last forever. It did not. The fortune scattered, the great mansions came down, and in time, even the name faded from the very top. If you want to see what happens when an even greater fortune meets no structure to protect it, their story is on your screen right now.